The question of the historicity of the Gospels is very much still alive. But how about we equip you to engage with the topic by answering some of the concerns raised and clarifying certain underlying principles you need to be on the lookout for? Stay around for the rest of the podcast.
SAF Podcast brings to you the coherent, cohesive, logical, and relevant defense of the Christian worldview. From laymen to experts in the field, everyone can tune in and be equipped. We also aim to introduce to the audience the plethora of work and research done in the field of Christian apologetics in defending the faith and the individuals who further the intellectual cause of Christianity by featuring the greatest minds of the Christian apologetics arena.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to yet another brand new episode of SAFT Podcast. And if this is your first time listening or watching to our content, staying subscribed would help you be in tune with some of the great content that we are rolling out for you. And today I am joined by the one and only Lydia Megru. Lydia, welcome to SAFT Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So Lydia is a prolific analytic philosopher and an author with a lengthy publication record in areas such as testimony, independence, probability theory, and she has displayed her expertise on the topic of the Gospels through her books, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, and also Mirror or the Mask, Liberating Gospels from Literary Devices. She is also the co-author with her husband Tim Megru of the book, Internalism and Epistemology, The Architecture of Reason. She has a doctorate from Vanderbilt University in English, and she also has an upcoming book titled The Eye of the Beholder. Now, apart from many of her other achievements, the one that I am most impressed with is that she and her husband co-authored a chapter on the resurrections in the mighty book, The Blackwell Companion to National Theology. And I struggled to get past the introduction of the book, so it's a pretty big deal to author a chapter on the book. And frankly, Lydia, I once had the experience to run into Tim on Facebook. So we had Clay Jones on the podcast, and he shared our podcast on the Christian Apologetics Alliance group. And I received a message from someone by the name Tim Megru, and this profile picture was the kid who accompanied Snoopy. So I felt like, oh, that's a fun little profile picture. And we chatted back and forth. He asked about the ministry. And then I went and looked at his profile and was like, whoa, Timothy Megru reached out to me on FB. So you guys are very active on Facebook, and to the people who are listening into the podcast, you have got to check out the Facebook group. If you're on Facebook, the group Megru Pies. Lydia and Tim are very active on the group. And as far as I've seen during the past months during which I've been in the group, if you raise a question or a concern or a doubt in the group, I've seen that Lydia has always been in the front line to help and dialogue and get clarity, and that has been very much helpful. So Lydia, how's the day been there for you? I know you have a lot on your plate and you have a lot of research works coming along. How's the week looking?
Well, I've just finished indexing my book, The Eye of the Beholder. I got those indexes to my publisher, and we're having blurbs coming in. We're happy about a blurb, it's like an endorsement. We're happy about those coming in. Of course, these are kind of sad and disturbed days here in the United States politically. And so I've had that on my mind. But at the same time, I'm very blessed. We got a little sunshine today here in Michigan. That means a lot. I'm not sure, what state are you in right now?
Well, right now I'm in the United Arab Emirates. In the UAE.
You're in,
so it's in the Middle East, in the United Arab Emirates.
Oh, you're in the middle. Oh, okay.
Yes.
So it's always sunny there, right? I mean,
it's quite cold right now. It's the winter time, so I'm quite shivery at this point, and it's also around midnight, so it's very cold.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, here it's dark and very cold because it's winter in Michigan as well, but we almost never see the sun in the winter, and we got a little sun today. So I was out for a walk, and that's why I was a little delayed for the podcast today. But it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right. God is still on the throne. So
excellent. And so today we're going to look at the question of the historical reliability of the Gospels. And you have done a lot of work on this field. You have written books on it. You have engaged in debates, and standing back and taking a view at the spectrum of the questions and challenges brought to the historical reliability of the Gospels. Do you see that these have genuine value as much as such that they warrant investigation and inquiry into this, or are they the mere result of an a priori commitment, bad technique, or ignorance and such?
Yeah, I mean, the Gospels themselves are so strong and stand up so strongly to investigation that I think the objections that get raised really are a result of bad methodology. And I think a lot of times the problem is that bad methodology is not evident to people on the face of it. So people hear it and they think, well, this sounds like something that has some value to it, this objection. And it's sometimes the objection will be cast in the form of looking at the gospel from the perspective of the original culture. And so people are very susceptible to that. They think, oh, okay, there must just be something I don't understand. And so that was part of why I wrote The Mirror or The Mask, was to show that no, these things that say that the gospel authors felt free to change things actually do not have value. But the way in which they don't have value, it takes some time to
Right.
explain. And so that's why I had to take that time to explain it.
Right. And recently I was engaged with one of my friends on the question of the historical reliability of the Gospels. And obviously, one of the main objections that comes is the census that Luke records in chapter 2, and how Josephus records the census and gives it later dating. So I'm not trained in the field of historical apologetics. I've done some reading, but I'm not trained. So obviously, you are an expert at this. So I feel like you can definitely answer this. My question is, when none of us in the 21st century are there back in the first century to witness the events. So all we are going with is plaques, coins, inscriptions, historians recording. So when we see Luke mention a census, let's say at AD 2, and Josephus records the census and says that it happened in, let's say, BC 6, why is it that we are inclined to say Josephus is right when in actuality both of them, either of them could be right, and it could be that Luke got it right and Josephus made the error? Why is it that in these investigations we are so inclined to say that Josephus is accurate historian and Luke is not? Is that a priori commitment, or is there some other methodology happening behind the scenes?
Yeah, I mean, you've got an excellent question there, and I'm inclined to say that there was more than one census. We have evidence of different censuses. Even Caesar Augustus himself carried out multiple censuses. Those were usually for purposes of counting citizens. And Jesus' guardian Joseph probably was not a Roman citizen, but
Right.
even so, it just shows that we shouldn't always assume that there's just one and only one census. And of course, it's the connection with Quirinius that's causing people to think
Yes.
that there could only be one under this governor, this guy named Quirinius. I addressed some of that in a video I have. I called it That Pesky Census. So if people look at my YouTube page, they can find the video on the pesky census, and then there's an accompanying blog post that goes into some more detail. But you're quite right, and it's funny you should bring that up, because the great classics scholar, the late great classic scholar Colin Hemer, said the same thing about the reference to Theudas in Acts. So Gamaliel refers to a rebellion led by Theudas,
Right.
and there's in Josephus a record of a rebellion led by someone named Theudas that would have been too late for Gamaliel to be referring to it. And so some scholars, including, I'm sorry to say, Craig Keener, have hypothesized that Luke just kind of got a very vague idea of what Gamaliel said there, and that he mentioned some rebellion, and that Luke just said, "Oh, I'll make him refer to the rebellion of Theudas," even though he didn't, have that much detail,
Right.
and even though that was anachronistic because he couldn't have been referring to it at that time. And
Right.
then Luke just didn't care because he was just trying to fill in the details. That's actually Craig Keener's theory. It's in his commentary on Acts, and I don't see any reason for that. And Hemer specifically says maybe it's the reliability of Josephus that should be in question here, rather than
Right.
the reliability of Luke, that Josephus might have gotten wrong when Theudas' rebellion was. Also, Hemer also brings up, I think quite rightly, the fact that that name, although that very specific form of the name is not found multiple times, that name could be another way of saying a number of other names. And I know you find this in the Middle East as well, that, Abraham, like there are different versions of the name Abraham in in Middle Eastern culture and so forth. And so similarly, Theudas could be a form of just some other name that's recorded elsewhere. And so it could just be two different people. So definitely we need to ask that. I tend to think in this case of the census that both Josephus and Luke are right, and that it's just referring to two different censuses.
Right. Yeah. So and I see that it's in these instances that we look for other arguments to validate the historical reliability of the Gospels. And one form of argumentation is where we bring the data of the names and cities recorded in the Gospels, and we show that to affirm the point that the authors were not only geographically proximate to the events, but also temporally proximate. They were in and around the same time, in and around the locations. So when I shared this with a skeptic, he just brushed it on the carpet saying, well, that is not any serious form of argumentation. Because to the common man, we can all guess names, we can all guess city names. And maybe that's because we are in the 21st century, we have so much knowledge about what's happening in different parts of the world, and therefore we can guess and figure out some names. But as a scholar, how strong is the case when we present the names and the cities recorded by the authors and their proximity to the real places in and around the areas where the Gospels are said to occur?
Yeah, actually, it's a very strong argument, and it's a sign of the fact that skeptics, and I'm afraid some Christians as well, don't understand the strength of an argument that's kind of subtle. They want, I literally saw, I think it was a video where Dr. Licona said that Dr. Peter Williams should not have used the name statistics argument in a debate with Bart Ehrman, and should instead have used references to like specific famous people. Actually, it's exactly the opposite. The name statistics argument is a better argument than the references to specific famous people, because you can stick specific famous people in there in like a what should I say, historical novel or something.
Right.
Hey, I'm going to stick Herod in here. I'm going to set it in the Victorian era. I'll have him meet Queen Victoria or whatever. But name statistics is far more subtle, and it's harder to get right.
Right.
If you ask a person in America today, hey, what's the most popular name in your region? Like if you asked me the most popular baby name in the Midwest in the last 10 years, I could not tell you. I would just be guessing. And so here you have four different authors telling stories that in some cases the names are not, given. Like, so for example, the name for Bartimaeus is given in Mark, but not given in Matthew or whatever. The names are not given in all of them. And you have the statistics, as Richard Bauckham has pointed out, falling out in approximately the proper proportions. So it's like a proportion issue. The most popular names in specifically Palestine for the men and the women are the most common names, and the least popular names, as we determined in totally independent ways from like carvings on graves and stuff, are the less popular names. And then also what we call disambiguation. And this is something that Dr. Bauckham has talked about, and also Dr. Peter Williams have talked about. So when you have a really popular name, you have to put in a nickname or a last name or something to know. Like in America, if somebody was named Bob, you'd have to say which Bob, because there's so many people named Bob or something like that. And they do that. So Simon, we have, Simon the tanner, Simon the son of Jonah, Simon the leper, and so the disambiguations are attached to the proper names. That is incredibly hard to do that. Like, hey, I'm going to make up a character. Oh, I know, I'll call him Simon because Simon was a popular name. Oh, then I'd better be sure to stick another thing after his name because it's a popular name. That'll make it look like it's a realistic story. There's no way that they're going to be thinking in those terms, especially in a novel in a time when there wasn't that kind of realistic novel. And that's another thing to realize, to not be anachronistic. The highly realistic detailed novel is a creation of hundreds and hundreds of years later, and the ability to do the research to find the statistics for the novel is a function of, as you were saying, the information age.
Right. And to push it to that extent and say, well, maybe the disciples actually did those research is making the theory more ad hoc and more improbable. I mean, a person can take an unreasonable position, but it's still an unreasonable position. And
Right.
speaking about Bob is a very common name. That's why we distinguish and say it's Bob the Builder that we're going to talk about when we watch the cartoons. And this argument came to a clarity to me when I returned from Calcutta. I was in India, in West Bengal, doing my studies for 3 years. And now that I'm back here, I have an idea about what are the most popular surnames in Calcutta, what are the most popular names in Calcutta. So if I hear a name, I'll be quite easily be able to distinguish whether that's a name from South India or the West or specifically from Calcutta, because I've been in and around that place. Even though for only 3 years, I've got the pulse of the names and cities and the places. So off the face of it, to us laymen, it may look like it's not an exactly powerful argument, but a bit of an inquiry into it will prove otherwise. And again, when it comes to this question of whether the disciples actually, when the authors did they actually get details right, we would say, well, if they had written erroneous data into it, if they had fudged with the details, especially about the high priest and the statements that they made and what has happened with the resurrection, it would have been obviously been called out, because people would know that they're giving out false information. But one question that I have is, we know that happens in this modern age, where if you write an article, it gets shared, published, people tweet, and the information disseminates to all people. But in that era, when scrolls are expensive and it takes time to write down and it takes time to circulate, can we really argue and say that if they had written erroneous data, it would have definitely been called out? I mean, wouldn't enough time have transpired that by the time it reaches around the place, or let's say the family where the person mentioned is recorded, the person would have passed away? So is that really a strong argument given what we know about scrolls and the circulation time it takes?
I think that's a good point. And I try to be careful about that particular argument. Someone would have stopped them. Someone would have called it out. You won't see me making that argument a whole lot. What I look for more is positive confirmation. So like in the case of the name statistics, or in the case of the high priest, for example, we find both John and Luke, though in different contexts, in different ways, alluding to the idea of multiple high priests. Right. So like Luke says, Annas and Caiaphas, the high priests, plural. And then people have said, oh, you could never have more than one high priest. And then you have John saying that Caiaphas was the high priest that year. And then you look up Josephus and you find the Romans kind of, setting up and deposing high priests. And even a few years later, Caiaphas had been there for a while, but just a few years later, he was deposed. And John says that Annas was his father-in-law, and Annas had previously been high priest. So you can put all this together and find that kind of mutual confirmation that, okay, you could think of them as both being regarded as high priests. But that's a better argument than saying, if Luke had gotten that wrong, someone would have called him out. It's better to show that John indirectly confirms him. Now, there are some things where I think you can do that a little bit more, where you have like a motive. So, for example, I was talking about the idea of Mary in my series on the virgin birth. Right. Suppose that Mary just lied and made up the virgin birth. 30 some years later, Jesus has died and the Christian movement is getting started, and Mary's there saying, hey, I was the mother of this of this very popular religious leader. Hey, I know, I'll make up a story that I conceived him when I was a virgin. Right. Well, and at that point, I think other sons, I'm a Protestant, so I think she did have other sons, James and Jude, are prominent leaders in the church. And the Bible refers to James as the Lord's brother. And, I do think that at that point, if their mother just suddenly started making up the virgin birth, and like there'd been no hint of this previously, then I do think James would have had a motive, and she would have known that James would have a motive to say, what are you talking about, Mom? This is weird, because in a sense, it would call into question his relationship with Jesus. He would be at most Jesus' half-brother at that point, as opposed to being Jesus' full kinsman. And to some extent, his status in the church depended on his kinship with Jesus. So there, I think we can make more of an argument that it would have been foolish for her to make this up all these years later out of a clear clear blue sky. But I think we have to be careful about those kinds of arguments.
Right. And when you mentioned John, about how John gives these extra details that are often missing out in other gospels, and how the gospels often complement each other. And as your book points out about these coincidences in the gospel, which are brilliant insights on many occasions. Many people would have an aversion, many skeptics specifically would have an aversion to the Gospel of John, because they say that the Gospel of John blows up the image of Jesus. It comes at a later dating, and there's an evolution that supposedly happens from Mark down to John. Do you see some sort of progression? Like we see that Mark's gospel is very brief. We see as the progression goes, the gospels get longer. But other than that, do you see any concerning historical reliability questioning progression that happens that puts to doubt the veracity of the accounts in John in any point?
No, I really don't, but you're right. That's a very popular view. I call it the Eohippus model. So if you're familiar with the horse, and you start out with this little horse, and I'm not saying anything about evolution here, I'm just making a metaphor, right? You start out with the small horse, and then the horse gets bigger and bigger, right? And the idea is that this just happens by, chance evolution. So that's this model, Mark is small, and then, it gets bigger and bigger as it gets to John. Well, first of all, it's not even true, because Luke is long. I mean, Luke is like as long as a scroll anyway, so there's not actually that gradual length. And I also think we have evidence that the ending of Mark was lost. I think the long ending of Mark that we have now was added because somehow like a sheet or something was lost at the end. So there's that too. But I don't think this evolutionary view is true. I do think it's true that John includes stories where Jesus is more explicit about his deity than he is in any of the stories in Mark. That doesn't mean he's not implying his deity in Mark. I think he is. But I think both sets of stories are historically true. And that gets us into the whole argument from silence. Well, if Jesus had really said, before Abraham was, I am, like in John 8, then surely Mark would have recorded it. That's a favorite argument of skeptics, Bart Ehrman, and even some, unfortunately, evangelical scholars, that, there's just this problem that these things are in John and are not in Mark. And I don't take that to be a problem. I think we have to stand firm on the weakness of that kind of argument from silence, where you take the silence of one document or witness and you set it against the clear statement of another witness. I mean, certainly if nobody says anything about anything, you don't have a right to make something up. Like if I'm just sitting here and I say, was there a bomb in Kalamazoo today? Kalamazoo is the city where I am. I have heard nothing about a bomb in Kalamazoo today. That's probably a pretty good argument that there was no bomb in Kalamazoo. Right. But on the other hand, if someone I have reason to trust comes to me and said, did you hear about the bomb in Kalamazoo today? And, I go and I ask someone else, hey, did you hear about the bomb? And he said, no, that doesn't mean the first person was lying. So there's a big difference, between saying, well, I have no reason to believe this at all, and on the other hand, setting one account against the mere silence of another account. Right, so we shouldn't do that between Mark and John. That's a very, very poor argument. And we don't know why Mark doesn't include those stories, or, why Peter maybe didn't tell them to Mark, or what they were emphasizing, or Matthew. But I think we have so much evidence for the reliability of John that I don't think we have any reason to think that Jesus didn't say those things. So I'm really looking forward to getting the eye of the beholder into people's hands to defend the historical reliability of John.
Right. And we know that you are in works on the book, The Eye of the Beholder. But if you can, is there one specific argument that you would like to pick out and use for the reliability of John that maybe, let me say, is specific or unique to John? Is there anything like that? I know that you're in the works of the book and you may not want to give out much more details, but is there anything that you can hint at?
Well, and it's a cumulative case too, so that makes it hard. Like, what's my favorite argument? There are so many, right? There are a number of what are called undesigned coincidences between John and the synoptics, and some of them I don't think I've ever mentioned before in other books that I bring out in The Eye of the Beholder. So, for example, the fact that the blind men in Jericho know that Jesus can heal the blind, and they call, or at least they seem to, and they call out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy. And then you realize when you reread the synoptics that there are no other miracles down there in that area of Jericho geographically prior to that. So it's
Right.
really weird. Like, how do they know this about him when they just hear he's passing by? And then you go over to John, and you've got not only the raising of Lazarus prior to that, but you also have the healing of the man born blind. And so, that's in John 9. And so they might very well have heard of that. And so there's the,
Right.
that's just one example. One that I really like is the argument from John's asides. So an aside is when you stop and you say something, like the narrator will say, oh, by the way, like an explanation.
Right.
So John's reporting of Jesus' words is often called into question, that he was adding or changing Jesus' words. And what you find, D.A. Carson emphasizes this a lot, by the way, the biblical scholar D.A. Carson. What you find is that John will stop and he'll explain something to his audience. So,
Right.
for example, when Jesus says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up, and they say it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it in 3 days? And there's a historical confirmation about that too, but I'm not going to go into that. But John pauses and says, he
Yes.
said this concerning the temple of his body. Now, if John was just making things up, he could have had Jesus talk to his disciples later and say, by the way, this is about my body and I'm going to rise from the dead. He could have put it into Jesus' mouth, but he doesn't. And we've got a number of those.
Yes.
Jesus says in John 7, that from the innermost being of someone who believes on me will come rivers of living water. And John says, this he said of the Holy Spirit who was not yet given.
Right.
The narrator says that. Jesus, if he was going to put his own ideas, his own interpretations into Jesus' mouth, he could have had Jesus say this. For the Spirit is coming, who shall be given, or something. We could put that in Jesus' mouth, but he doesn't.
Right.
And so that's excellent evidence. And in that particular case, too, Jesus says, as the scripture says, from his innermost being will come rivers of living water. And we don't know which scripture it is. Now, that's just amazing evidence that this is not something John made up. If John was going to make something up, he would surely make it a clearer
Yes.
allusion to some Old Testament scripture. He wouldn't throw this mysterious thing in. And so, as the great late scholar Leon Morris said, it's possible that Jesus used scripture in an unusual way, but it's very unlikely that John would have thought of causing him to do this in a way that was, sure to raise a question about what scripture he's referring to. So those are the kinds of somewhat subtle, but I think really strong arguments that I'm bringing out.
Right. So I guess we'll have to wait for the book, and we hope that it reaches the shelves pretty quick. And so recently we had our Reasonable Faith chapter directors training meeting, and our fellow director Kirk McGregor, he did a video presentation as part of the training, and he talked about his latest book, and it explores the Gospel of John from a philosophical and theological and a historical standpoint. And in that book, he posits that the author of John is not the disciple John, the brother of James, but another disciple named John. And in that presentation, it was just a brief overview of his book. I haven't read the book yet, but he makes very clear that he's not questioning the historical reliability of John, but just the fact that it is not exactly the disciple John that we normally think of, but another John who was there with Jesus at the Lord's Supper, who ran with Peter to the tomb. So this guy was present in and all around the same place. He was there with the disciple John. What is your take on that position? Does that hold water?
I don't think it holds water. I think he was the son of Zebedee. What I've done in my forthcoming book is I put my arguments, most of them, about that specific question into an appendix. So my goal was to be sort of tactful toward people who took that position, and for the very reason that you've just said, because they do support the historical reliability of John, and that in the body of the book I wanted to say mostly stuff that they would be able to be on board with, but then I
Right.
do think it's an important question. And so I put that in a fairly long appendix where I use the arguments from Richard Bauckham, which I'm pretty sure are going to be the same as McGregor, because Richard Bauckham's the most famous recent proponent of that view, the view that it was a different John. And I really believe that Bauckham is misinterpreting the patristic evidence. I just read a little snippet from the person you mentioned, McGregor, right?
Yes.
I found that online. I read a little snippet from it. And it's concerning. He seems to imply that Irenaeus, the great church father Irenaeus, implied that the Gospel of John was written by this other John. And that is false. I mean, I have a big section on Irenaeus in my appendix, and I think he's saying it was the son of Zebedee, and he doesn't address that question because, in my opinion, that question hadn't arisen. So it's
Right.
all. I mean, nobody had proposed that it was anybody else at that point, in my opinion. So it's all inferential. But I think Bauckham really has to engage in some ad hoc reasoning to say that Irenaeus thinks it's someone else. In fact, one of the interesting issues concerns disambiguation, and I have a section on that related to what we were talking about before, about where you have a popular name and then you have to use something else, right? Like Bob the Builder. John was a pretty popular name, at least in Palestine at that
Right.
time. And what we find is Irenaeus and other church fathers, like they'll say, John, the disciple of the Lord, the apostle. Now, the idea is supposed to be that these are, I think, disambiguators, because there could
Right.
be someone else named John. Well, okay, then Richard Bauckham has to theorize, and I think those who take the other John have to theorize that it didn't work, that there was still ambiguity, that there were two people who were John, the apostle, who could be called an apostle, the disciple of the Lord. And as I put it in my appendix, what is the point of a disambiguator that does not work to disambiguate? Right? If Irenaeus is going to go to all this trouble to say John, the disciple of the Lord, and he calls him an apostle, presumably he thought there was only one, and that he was therefore being clear. So what they have to do with the patristic evidence of the church fathers is to make it unclear when the church fathers seem to think they are being clear.
Right.
And I think that's a really great weakness in that theory. One of the main reasons I think it's important to talk about, and I do this, some of it in the body of the book as well, is that I know for Bauckham, I don't know about McGregor, he thinks that the author was what I call a stay-at-home. He calls him non-itinerant, that he stayed mostly in the Jerusalem area and was not present for Jesus' Galilean ministry. Now, of course, you can have something at just one remove and it's still very reliable. Luke wasn't present at Jesus' Galilean ministry either, and I think he's a very reliable witness. But why do that? I mean, if someone was personally present, it's better to acknowledge that.
Right.
So he has to have, he even says like that Nathaniel was the witness to the marriage at Cana, and John wasn't there, you know? And so that I think that gets really complex. And so I bring quite a bit of evidence that I believe the author was traveling with Jesus to Galilee and back to Jerusalem, and therefore was an eyewitness to a lot more of Jesus' ministry, not just the part that was in the Jerusalem area. And then that strengthens our confidence in the truth of the reports. So that's where I do think it gets a little bit important to the to the reliability of the gospel.
Yes, and obviously, a person who would posit that it was not the son of Zebedee who wrote John would also have to deal with the book of Revelation because of the similarity of the word usages, as I've been told. So that's also a point to explore. And as we come to the conclusion of this podcast, as we take a step back and look at what should we do when we are dealing with this question of historical reliability, where does the battle actually lie when someone brings up the question of historical reliability? Do we go after one contradiction after the other, or is there an underlying principle that the objector might be having that we should focus on first and foremost in better neutralizing the objection of the historical reliability of the Gospels?
Yeah, I think we need to be prepared to do both. And, obviously each objector is different and has his own, approach. In my book, Hidden in Plain View, I set aside the question of contradictions and I made the positive case using undesigned coincidences, which are these puzzle-like fittings. And so I said, let's get that as a background. Then once we see that as a background, that can help to put these alleged contradictions into context so that we see that actually there's all this positive evidence. And I find that people do this with like Luke and the census. So a skeptic will say, oh, that census, Luke, is totally unreliable. And I'm like, are you aware of the mountain of evidence that Luke is very reliable?
Right.
So they're picking out that one thing and dismissing the reliability of Luke. Sometimes I will have people write to me, Christians, and they'll say, what's your answer to this objection? And sometimes there's an air of anxiety in the correspondence.
Yes.
And Tim, this happens to Tim too. I mean, we've even had people write, if you can't answer this objection, I'm going to deconvert or something like that. Like they're one objection away from deconverting. And every time when that happens, I say to the person, slow down. Go more slowly. Take your time. Go find out the positive case. Go get a sense for the weight of the positive case. And I introduce them to this phrase, the fallacy of objections. And that's from one of those older authors in the 1700s, 1800s. The fallacy of objections is this, objection, 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 objection. And if I can't answer everyone, it's all gone, instead of getting what I call a sense of the landscape. So if you're up on a mountain, you look and you have a sense of the landscape, then you can see the objections are small compared to, the positive evidence. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we should have no preparation in answering alleged contradictions. And so this is why in my video series, I've done some of that. So I had a recent video, for example, on the virgin birth, where I talked about the alleged contradiction where Luke seems to be saying that the family of Jesus went right back right away to Nazareth, and that would conflict with the flight to Egypt.
Right.
And I said right out that I actually think it does look like Luke thought they went back right away. And, I've gotten some pushback on that, and I understand, and the whole issue of inerrancy comes in there. And, I've had to say to some people in dialogue, we have to be willing to accept that there are implications, and we have to be delicate about that. We don't want to overinterpret, but we also don't want to underinterpret, so that occasionally we do have these tough, apparent discrepancies where we have to be willing to say, yeah, that does kind of look like a discrepancy. And I don't just have an answer right off to say, oh, no, that's not a discrepancy at all, but then we place that in the context of this overwhelming evidence of Luke's reliability. And in my opinion, it becomes a pretty small matter. If Mary, for example, was being, shall we say, discreet and skipped over the story of the flight to Egypt and the Magi, and she didn't have to word it in a way that implied they went right back. She could have said, and later, when we were in Nazareth, and there was a year when Jesus was 12, and we went to Jerusalem. She could have just skipped right over it, and then Luke doesn't know, and so he writes a smoother transition there. That really does not call Luke's reliability into question in any significant regard, whereas the skeptic wants to use it to say that Matthew made up the flight to Egypt. I mean, the skeptic wants to use it for this giant, invention, and it certainly doesn't justify that. So I think we have to be really nuanced, if I can say so, and be willing to address objections head on, but at the same time to tell people, hey, that's not where all the action lies. I call it a whack-a-mole game. I don't know if you have whack-a-mole in the United Arab Emirates, but it's this, and maybe I'm dating myself, but where you have a hammer and boom, 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 right? And I say evidentialist apologetics is not a whack-a-mole game, where what we're doing all the time is just sort of reacting, bang, bang, bang. And if we don't whack all them on the head, we die,
Right.
you're dead, like a video game or something. It's not like that. We are actually on the offense with the massive amounts of positive evidence. And so I'm hoping that by my books and my video series, I can give a sense of that larger picture.
Right. And it's been faced with these challenges and difficult questions that some scholars, some Christian scholars, in fact, would try and say that, well, Luke or John smudged the narrative. They changed the details to emphasize a point. And it strikes very odd to me for them to say that, as if they were not concerned with the historical reliability, but they just want to emphasize some point. Is that driven by some data? Is there some sort of backing to it? Maybe some sort of classical literature backing? Or is that them desperately looking for an escape that is not there in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, they think it's driven by data. Obviously they're sincere, right, when they say it, but I think
Right.
they're sincerely wrong. And that's part of why The Mirror or the Mask is so fat. The book is thick. Why? Well, because I wanted to go back thoroughly into that classical data, the so-called exercise books, and something that Tim and I have said to various people who ask us about that is, okay, you need to understand we're saying that these literary devices weren't even a thing, that involved changing the facts. Let's just cut the legs out from under it. Now, there are multiple levels. I also think even if they had been a thing, that the gospel authors would not have had reason to use it. They would have said, well, then I'm not going to do that, because they had reason to want to be accurate and truthful, and they knew their audience would believe them if they wrote that something happened. But it's even more radical than that. So I think that where it's coming from to some extent is an aversion to harmonization. I think harmonization has gotten a really bad name in the scholarly community, even in the evangelical scholarly community. So you'll see, for example, Dr. William Lane Craig has really kind of downplayed the harmonization concerning the temple cleansing. He'll say there is no need to resort to such an artificial harmonization as 2 temple cleansings. And other scholars, Craig Blomberg and Alan Chappell and D.A. Carson, these guys, they've argued, well, that isn't artificial. It's actually a pretty good explanation that there were two temple cleansings. So I think there's this aversion to harmonization. So you have an aversion to harmonization, but then at the same time, you don't want to use the word unreliable, right? And so then you believe, if I say it was a literary device accepted at the time, then I can say it's compatible with reliability. Now, that's not actually true. I mean, they make an analogy to movies based on true events. Do you consider movies based on true events to be historically reliable? No. If a movie is merely based on true events, it is an accepted literary device of our time, but it's an accepted literary device of making a work of literature that isn't reliable.
Right.
So they got this confused idea in their minds that if they said it was an accepted literary device, then they could simultaneously say it was reliable, and then they didn't have to harmonize, and they could have it all, right?
Yes.
They have their cake and eat it too, in a sense. And that's incorrect. If the gospel authors really did this like that, where they were deliberately changing the facts, then literary device or not, their gospels would not be reliable. So there's a lot at stake. And it's fortunate that what I call the reportage model is actually defensible, strongly defensible on historical grounds. And that's what I'm trying to show people. And that's why I call my YouTube channel and my branding Making Common Sense Rigorous. So that's what we're doing when we have common sense and you say, well, that seems like a weird idea that John moved the temple cleansing. It's like, you're right. And let me tell you why you're right in more rigorous terms.
Wow, excellent. And we've reached the end of this amazing podcast. And I just wanted to ask one question to Lydia that I know that you are in a very much capable position to answer, because you handle your YouTube channel. You're very active, like I mentioned, on the Facebook group McGroupies. You homeschool your children. You do research, author books, speak at conferences, and you are a homemaker. So you handle a very rigorous professional life, serving the kingdom, and also you do not cut corners when it comes to your personal life, and you have a lot of responsibilities there. Now, for a person who might be looking to balance it, their commitment to the kingdom, their professional life, and also to not sacrifice on their personal life. Maybe not in the same extent that you are having, but in those similar senses. What would be some advice or some sort of encouragement that you would like to give to them?
Yeah, and it's tough. I have one, and I'm lucky. Right now I have only one child that I'm still homeschooling. If I had more, I wouldn't be able to do as much. So I think the single most important piece of advice I would give is be intentional.
Right.
Whatever you are doing, be intentional. If you're going to take a vacation, you're going to take a break, that's fine. If but decide how much of a break you're going to take and then take it. If you want to spend time scrolling through your news feed on Facebook, that could be okay, but don't just fall into it. Do it
Right.
intentionally and figure out how much time you're going to spend doing that, and then stop. If you're going to focus on your family, that's great. Do that and don't feel guilty about it. Nobody can be in two places at once. Nobody except, God, and we're not God. So whatever you do, as the Bible says, do it with all your might. What your
Right.
hand finds to do it with all your might. And if you're intentional, then you don't have to have that vague feeling of guilt all the time that whatever you're doing, you feel
Exactly.
like you should be doing something different. And
Yes.
that will drain you faster than anything else. That feeling that you're killing yourself and yet you feel guilty like you're killing yourself working on the wrong thing. Don't do that. Pick good
Right.
things to do, things that are right and legitimate to do, and then do them intentionally, and commit your ways to God, and keep your heart clean, and keep short accounts with God, and you will be able to live your life with more energy.
Wow. Thank you so much, Lydia, for that brilliant advice, and also for covering this very large topic on historical reliability quite effectively in our conversations. We were very much delighted to have you here, and we hope that you had a wonderful experience on your first time on SAFT Podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Well, I will drop in the links to Lydia's books, The Mirror of the Marks and Hidden in Plain Sight, in the description, and also the link to her YouTube channel. And definitely, if you're on Facebook, if you're a Facebook person, you need to get into the group Make Do Peace, because that is a great place to get your questions on these topics cleared, and there's a great community ready to engage in these topics. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and stick around as we await the coming of the next podcast on SAFT. See you, and God bless.